Hello, hello, welcome back to Let's Talk. Today doing another edition of Let's Talk Lovecraft. Last episode was The Call of Cthulhu. Now I'm moving on to The Color Out of Space. Just finished up a craft beer review. That will be up shortly, so be sure to check that out as well. I love myself a big hearty Imperial Stout on a cold winter day. Alright, we'll get that out of the way. And talk some Lovecraft. Alright guys, The Color Out of Space is a 1927 horror sci-fi short fiction story from H.P. Lovecraft, of course. It first appeared in Amazing Stories of the old pulp magazine. And there have been film adaptations in 1965, 87, and 2010. And I'm hearing from some people that the movie Annihilation with Natalie Portman came out earlier this year, borrows liberally from this story as well. So maybe that's worth checking out. This is a story set near Arkham, that is H.P. Lovecraft's fictional town in Massachusetts. The narrator is a surveyor getting ready to sort of prepare the territory for the building of a dam which will flood these old valleys and sort of almost virgin timberlands of New England, and he finds an area that just does not look right. It is barren on the at the center, but is surrounded by sort of gnarled and twisted growth that is not quite normal. And so he gets talking about it, gets asking people about it in town. Most people don't want to say too much. They're acting a little bit dodgy, as if they've been fearing something. But he finally finds a guy named Andy Pierce, who tells him that the location is called the Blasted Heath, and he gives him a sort of a history of what happened there 50 years ago. And nearly the entire rest of the story is, of course, our narrator, who is unnamed, sort of relating the story of Amy Pierce as told to him at this time. So what happens is a meteor crashes, what is apparently a meteor, on the property of Nahum Gardner and his family. He has a couple of sons and a wife. And they bring in scientists from Arkham, from Miskatonic University, that is, of course, Lovecraft's fictional university that appears in many of his stories. And they take samples of the meteorite, and they find that the meteorite is hot, and they cut a sample off of it, and the samples keep shrinking and disappearing, sort of like this whole thing is dissolving. And they can't identify any of the substances that it's made of. The next night, storm comes through, and this thing seems to be attracting lightning. There are 6 lightning strikes in the same place, and when they come back in the morning, the meteorite is gone, leaving only some of the, what he calls globules behind of color. And maybe they think that the excitement is over, but that is not to be the case. So the next spring, he starts noticing strangeness in the plants. They're growing to unusual sizes, and they're taking on strange colors. And of course, the color is the thing about this story. You keep hearing them referring to it as the color, but it's never given a sort of an adequate description, and that is, of course, because it is considered to be indescribable, which is slightly laughable, but it works in this context, sort of almost as a metaphor. So these oversized plants, they grow, and when they harvest, they find that none of them are edible. They've taken on some sort of bad taste. Sort of reminds me of, you ever see the episode of The Simpsons where they fertilize the gardens with radioactive waste from the nuclear power plant, and Homer comes up with something called tobacco. It's tobacco and tomatoes at the same time, and the people don't like it, but of course the animals do. So the hope is that with the plants and the rain and the water absorbing these chemicals, whatever this negative effects from the meteorite is, that it'll wash itself out of the system and things will be okay. But that is, of course, not to be. Things actually get worse. Everything starts taking on this sort of this luminous color at night, and the blight spreads throughout the area. Eventually, animals become affected. They go crazy, they get sores and sicknesses that can't be sort of easily identified by the veterinarians, but even the local veterinarian becomes sort of afraid of coming there and checking them out because he's afraid of what he might catch himself. The animals start dying and turning to like a gray ash. And that's something to remember because that is important later on. And then eventually, after these plants and animals are dying, it spreads to the humans, and they're not entirely sure why. The animals were not fed the infected feedstocks, and neither were the people on Gardner's family eating and drinking sort of what they believed to be infected food or animals. But gradually, his wife starts to go crazy. He ends up locking her up, chaining her in a room in the attic, and the kids either get sick and die or vanish altogether. And Named Gardner sort of expresses this by explaining that something was sucking the life out of them, sucking the life out of everything. And they describe it as being something from somewhere where things are not as they are here. Something fully outside of comprehension, out of our universe, which is, of course, a really essential, common through line for most, pretty much, not just most, but I'm guessing everything that Lovecraft ever wrote. Amy ends up fleeing from the house after seeing his friend Named Gardner die, and the next day he comes back to the farm with 6 men, 3 police officers, and the coroner, and I think there was a scientist or something like that. And they find eventually that there are dead bodies at the bottom of the well, and they're getting frightened, more and more frightening, and the landscape becomes more and more active. The trees are shimmering and shaking and glowing without any sort of discernible wind or cause. And eventually this color, this indescribable color, shoots into the sky like a moonbeam. And everybody is afraid, they're terrified. The animals, their horses run off, they run off. Amy goes home, and he refuses to return to what they call the blasted Heath. As they're watching, just before they leave, they see, or actually, next morning they come back and find that everything, like the animals had already done and like the people had already done, turns to a gray ash. It turns into what they call the blasted Heath. And 50 years later, when our narrator shows up to survey for this dam, he finds things much in the same condition, and any people who are local to the area, they've moved away. Immigrants have tried to come in and colonize the area, but nobody can stand to stay because of this lurking fear. Yes, that is a call to another story. And there's this fear that maybe this thing that leapt up into space after coming down from space is maybe it left something behind. Maybe it is slowly spreading and will eventually envelop the entire area. And that is about it. Our narrator, he does the surveying, and he sort of looks forward to the time when it'll be buried beneath the water of the reservoir behind the dam, because the idea is that maybe that will take care of it, whatever has been left behind in this contaminated land. But there's also the fear that maybe it'll seep into the water and continue to spread. I've read this story twice now, and first time, yeah, it's intriguing. Second time was a lot better. I read it, but I followed along with an audiobook version I found on YouTube, and I find that a lot of Lovecraft's sort of awkward prose style, it actually feels a lot more natural being read out loud. There's still, the way he writes is, in my opinion, my educated opinion, based on my sort of college background in writing, it's not quite proper. It's very much has an amateurish edge to it, but it's also a little bit like he's maybe depending on the thesaurus a little bit more than he probably should. And this, a lot of it sort of goes away, it sort of fades away when you hear it recited, because the voiceover is a little bit more adept at timing and pacing, and you really get caught up in it. And I actually enjoyed this story a lot more this time than I did the previous time. But it is, I would say, just about head over heels a better written story than The Call of Cthulhu. And if this is any indication, I think I'm going to really probably start to fall in love with Lovecraft. I read these stories the first time, and I found them intriguing vaguely, but I was just sort of infuriated by his writing. But it's growing on me. I'm becoming more accepting of it, and I think I'm going to end up being a very serious Lovecraft fan eventually. So just a few final thoughts here. I think it's really odd how throughout the story they refer to this thing as the color out of space. The color, everything has this color, but no one can describe it. But the only description that Lovecraft gives it is as being something beyond sort of our visible spectrum, but yet it is visible, which is of course impossible. But I find it to be an interesting device, sort of keeping this vague. They've done movies of it. I've not seen those movies. I don't quite know how you would convey this, because you would have to give things a literal color. But I think in my imagination, I see things sort of bathed in a kind of a purple, shimmering weirdness. It's probably a story best left to the imagination. And you cannot get away with that sort of device in a novel, but in a short story, I think it's more plausible, it's more acceptable. But what was the thing that came in the meteor? My theory is, it's a being, it's a life form that is traveling in an interstellar way slowly, but I think every once in a while it needs to find a place to either reproduce or eat and recharge. It feeds itself and fuels itself off of living matter, and then moves on, and maybe it leaves some babies behind. The narrator sort of gave the suggestion that maybe it was sort of beyond our reachable cosmos, meaning it is from another dimension, from a place that we could not travel to, even if we could travel to the stars. And that's an interesting concept that really goes in line with a lot of the mythos that Lovecraft has spun. But I do like the idea of it being, to me at least, to being a traveler. You get stories like this occasionally, like in Star Trek and things like that, and beings capable of living in space. But it really sort of like some of his other stories sort of calls to mind the old, the ancient astronaut theory, the idea that that life is seeded, and maybe sometimes the seeds that come to our Earth are bad seeds. And I will leave you with that, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I hope it wasn't rambling too much there. I'm still getting used to Lovecraft. I'm still getting used to sort of expressing myself on video in terms of explaining what I've read. So hopefully I'll get better at this in the days and months ahead as I continue to soldier on with more of Let's Talk H.P. Lovecraft. So if you're still sticking with me, thank you. Please subscribe, and I will see you next time. Beer.